We'll get back to where we left off. We spent time in Galatians looking at Paul's approach to the same subject matter that Hebrews is dealing with, both at the promise, sacrifice, and the fact that the people he was writing to wanted to go back to the old Jewish ways. And ultimately, the conclusion that they both reach is the same, with some nuanced differences in the way they interpret it. So now we can jump back into Hebrews. And I want to go through these 5 verses here as a little pretty quickly here and get to the next rabbit that's jumped in front of us here that I need to chase. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats and with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." What it's talking about here, obviously we talk about the Day of Atonement. We looked at all those things that you do on the Day of Atonement to carry off the sins into the wilderness. What he's describing here is how the law was inaugurated the first time, when the tabernacle was cleansed the first time, and then how it was successively cleansed after that in the same way. But this here is specifically talking about the first covenant being inaugurated, the tabernacle being set up and the law being inaugurated as part of that process here. So in doing all of that, in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So what he describes here is how those sins, how sin is cleansed. And last week, I talked about this notion of how God, just like with human beings, you approach young human beings and teach them in a certain way, but as you progress and get older, you are taught differently in a more sophisticated way in more detail. And you can see the same progress take place in the Bible. God has dealt with man in the same sorts of ways. And so that idea has been recognized by humans, and they did what they normally do. They take it and make an intricate theology out of it, and they call it dispensationalism. Here are the most common 7 dispensations that are tracked in dispensationalism. Starting with Adam and Eve in innocence, Noah with conscience, human government between Noah and Abraham. Then Abraham receives the promise. And then after Abraham and the children of Israel become the focus, the law is given. So from Moses to Christ, it's the law. Then with the coming of Christ, you have the church age, which is what we are in now. And then once the return of Christ happens, we will have the millennial kingdom. So those are the 7 most common dispensations. Now, if you've read the Bible in any significant way, I think you will see that it could be quite easy to come up with about 6 or 8 more dispensations if you wanted to. These are the ones that get used. Why just these 7? Because it has to be 7. Superstitiously, we have to use that number because it's the complete number. So obviously there has to be 7 dispensations. But you could have a lot more. Or you could throw out some of these and replace them with other things. Because God has dealt with people differently at different times throughout the Bible. And I'm going to show you next that in this period between the time the law was given and the church age, there was a significant shift in the way the topic at hand, forgiveness, was looked at. So that's why I bring this up, and we can kind of see that progression take place in our own personal lives. You can see progression everywhere. That's how God moves. That's how God works. We saw this idea at the beginning of this book because the writer of Hebrews says the same thing. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. That was one way, which, by the way, is not in this list. You see, between law and grace, is there a prophet, age of the prophets? No. So he spoke to us long ago by the prophets, but in these days, these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed to the heirs, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. So here we see God working in a different time in different ways. The idea of dispensationalism, I would not call the idea of dispensationalism wrong in its broad stroke, but trying to formulate a theology out of it is not something we are told to do in the scripture. So what is forgiveness? What is atonement? And are they the same thing? We looked at this idea. And forgiveness is not the same thing as atonement, and atonement is not the same thing as forgiveness. Atonement requires you to do something to atone for what you did. Forgiveness is simply forgiveness. There is no cause for forgiveness. It's just something that the person or thing that needs to forgive does. So I guess this is the main question. How do you get forgiveness? One way to get forgiveness in the Bible, when we think about it, is through atonement. But if it's atonement, you're exchanging something for your forgiveness. So if I asked you, how do you get forgiveness, what would you say? Do we pull out any animals?
No. Thank goodness, no.
So all we're doing is just asking for forgiveness, which is not what the law did. And here's the verses, the chapters from Leviticus that I was getting to last week. These chapters in Leviticus 4 and 5 especially connect the idea of atonement and sacrifice and forgiveness. On the Day of Atonement, the formula is different because on the Day of Atonement, you cleanse the temple, you cleanse the priest, you cleanse everything, and then you do a procedure to get the sins on a goat and send the goat off. That's how you get rid of sin. These two chapters in particular, and a few places after that, talk about personal atonement and forgiveness. So it starts off, speak to the people of Israel. God is telling Moses, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally, again, in any of the Lord's commandments about the things not to be done, and does any one of them, the priest shall make an atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. So you make an atonement, and you're forgiven. The atonement is to do a sacrifice. There are several of these in the two chapters, and it is a progression again, because it starts off by saying, if you're a priest and you sin, you have to bring a bull. Or if the whole nation sins, you have to bring a bull, which there are some specifications between the two bulls. If you're a ruler or leader, well, then you only have to bring a goat, but it has to be a male goat. If you're a common person, you can get by with a female goat. So you see how the progress is going. I mean, if you sin up here, you got to go all in. Down here, it's not quite as big a deal. If you're a common person that can't afford a female goat, you can bring a female lamb. If you can't afford that, you can bring two birds. And if you can't afford two birds, you can just bring some flour. So you see how that progresses through there. But the key, again, to point out is if any one person commits one sin. Now, how often does one person commit one sin? You're going to need a big farm. So this was not something that you did all the time for every sin. This, and if you read it, it explains the purpose for this is if you commit one of these unintentional sins that you then realize you've committed and you're sorry for committing it and you want to clear it up, this is the procedure for doing so before the Day of Atonement. Why is it important to have a way to get rid of sin, a sin, before the Day of Atonement? You got to remember how these people are thinking, not just in Israel, but all over the world. If you do something to make a God mad, what's that God going to do? He's going to punish you. He's going to bring it on. So you want to make sure you can find a way to appease that God so he doesn't do that to you. And you don't want to wait a year just to see if it happens within that year. So if you discover that you've committed a sin and you want to clear it up right away, here was the procedure for doing it. And they all end the same way. The priest shall make an atonement for him and he shall be forgiven. So you see this repeated through these two chapters. So how do you get forgiven of sin? You make an atonement, in this case animals, and that sin is forgiven. God forgives you because you made an atonement. That's the Torah, that's the law. So here's one way to get rid of sin. And you mentioned to me before that all you had to do was ask. Well, where does that idea come from? Well, here's one of people's favorite verses in the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who call by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal them. What do you have to do to get forgiven of sin? You have to pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, and you will be forgiven. Now, what we generally notice about this verse is pray and God will hear and forgive. But they're seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. So repentance is involved. All of this is an atonement. It's just a different way of thinking about atonement. You don't have to pull out an animal and sacrifice it. This comes after a very lengthy prayer that Solomon did. This is God coming to Solomon after the fact and saying, okay, I've heard your prayer and I'm agreeing to what you said. I want to go through that prayer and look at it in some detail because it points out something else. Let's go back to what we've been talking about here. Exodus 25, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in the midst. I being God. God tells Moses, make me a sanctuary that I can move into. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God. Where is God? Dwelling among the people of Israel. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. Leviticus 26. Leviticus 16 we've already seen. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die, for I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. Where was God? In the cloud on the mercy seat. This is the way they were thinking about God. Let's move over to 1 Kings, where we were just discussing. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel, the temple's done. They're doing to the temple what they did to the tabernacle in Exodus when it was completed. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. So what are they doing? They're doing the same things. They pulled out all these animals every animal they could get their hands on to sacrifice to cleanse the temple and to purify everything so the first day of atonement could be had with the temple. And when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord. Same thing that we see when the first law is instituted with the tabernacle. So that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And this is the temple, the constructed temple. And then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have indeed built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. So far, this sounds just like what we see in the law, in the Torah. We just have a new, better house for God to move into. And they're setting us all up. And Solomon declares, I built you a nice house for you to move into. Down to verse 20. Now the Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made, for I have risen in the place of David my father and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and I built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Does that sound a little different than what we've been seeing? Kind of changing the way they're thinking about this now. So he's built a house for God to move into, but he's acknowledging here God doesn't live in a house. And in fact, the earth can't contain God. So there's some progress here in the way people approach God, in the way they think about God. And you can see the transition taking place. There's no language like this in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books. Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea. Solomon talking to God. O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers toward this place, and listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place, and listen in heaven, your dwelling place, and hear, and when you hear, forgive. So it's understood God doesn't live in the house, even though it's his house to live in. God can't be contained by the house. His name is there, meaning the house, the temple, represents God. That's what it does. It has his name. And they pray toward that house because that house represents God, because they can't see God and pray literally to God that they see. So they pray toward this place as a representation of him. So you can see how this is all a little more sophisticated than what we see in the Torah. And notice this last part. And listen in heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. Doesn't say anything about after we sacrifice an animal. When your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they turn again to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them again to the land that you gave to their fathers. This is the formula from 2 Chronicles 7:14 as in his initial prayer. This is what he's saying he wants God to do. If there is a famine in the land, and if there is a pestilence or a blight or a mildew or a locust or caterpillar, if their enemy besieges them in the land at their gates, whatever plague, whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever plea is made by any man or by all your people Israel. So this covers the entire nation, but it also goes to the individual, any man. So we see the distinction we were just talking about, the sacrifices. By all your people Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart and stretching out his hands toward this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each whose heart you know according to all his ways. For you only, know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake. Now, when this talks about foreigners, these are people who come to Israel to join in Israel and to partake in the worship of God and Israel. But a foreigner in the New Testament equates to what? What's the word we use in the New Testament? Gentile. So this is the same idea that we see in the New Testament between Jew and Gentile. So when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country to your namesake, hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. So there's something that's different here from what we were seeing take place in the Torah. And God says, this is the way I'm going to deal now. And forgiveness can come about through what? Simply asking for forgiveness and doing a repentance, a turn, not continuing in your sin. So the idea that only a prayer works has reached this point. Now, that's a little bit contradictory to what we're seeing here. And this is where you kind of have to adjust your thinking about what we're trying to accomplish in Hebrews, what the writer of Hebrews is trying to accomplish. Notice here what we just read. In the first covenant, you had to do all these things to make it work. And then everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The process that he's just described to us in chapters 8 and 9 involve a true tent. He talks about a true tent. What happens in that true tent? Jesus, after his death, takes his blood into the true tent and offers a sacrifice of himself that is the pure sacrifice in this true tent. What he's saying by saying that, he doesn't tell us that this is all just a theological statement. He's saying it in a practical way. Jesus goes there and does this. So what he's there saying is what was done in the Old Testament still has to be done. You have to physically offer an atonement. And Jesus physically offered that atonement. That's what he's been describing. Which runs counter to the notion that all you have to do is ask for forgiveness. Even though, even in the Old Testament, Solomon is describing a process where you only ask for forgiveness without the sacrifices. So we got both of these things going on. Paul talks about this same thing, where Christ is the pure sacrifice, and his death and blood brings about our forgiveness. Through him, we can get forgiveness. Paul never once talks about a process like this actually happening. This is the only place in the New Testament you see this, is here in the book of Hebrews, where he is describing Christ is actually doing a sacrifice. Is that what he was really wanting us to get out of this? That Christ, when he died, actually went into a temple and offered his blood on an altar? It's an open question, but that is what we're seeing. So, the first covenant is inaugurated with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. That is why Jesus had to die. That's an important thing in early Christianity. That's how early Christianity got started in the first place. They realized Jesus' sacrifice was the important thing that happened. Thus, it is necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So, this verse again returns to the idea. Once we get past where he says the shedding of blood is necessary for the forgiveness of sins, he turns right back around to saying an actual sacrifice had to happen. It was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. The emphasis here doesn't necessarily need to be on the process of Christ offering a physical sacrifice. The weight of what he's describing here, he intends to be on what he just said in verse 26, that Christ was the pure sacrifice that had to be offered. And the technical description of Christ entering into a temple with his own blood is really secondary to the point he's trying to get across to these people. And this is where he's trying to take them. Their idea is they want to go back to the Old Testament way. That's what we know from the beginning chapters. He's trying to tell them going back to the Old Testament ways is not the way that you now do this. He's now showing them that the reason you don't do it that way anymore is because that process was completed. It doesn't have to be done anymore. He puts Jesus in that context physically, as physically taking the sacrifice into the temple and offering it, just to be very explicit to them about how this sacrifice completed the process. He doesn't mean to emphasize the process of Christ doing it. He's emphasizing, and this is the way to get through their barrier, he's emphasizing Christ's sacrifice was the final sacrifice. That's what he's emphasizing here. He has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So that's what he's trying to emphasize. So this chapter ends this way. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, who will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, because that's already been done, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. So we're going to move to chapter 10. And chapter 10 is connected to these two verses. These two verses are the beginning of a paragraph that continues in chapter 10. But the point of chapter 10 is going to be off of verse 28. He's now dealt with sin, and now that's going to save us. He's dealing with salvation now, and how salvation comes from that for those who eagerly are waiting for him. So we'll pick it up in chapter 10 next week from here.